The morning sun beat down mercilessly on Camp Pendleton, as Sarah Martinez adjusted her server's apron for what felt like the 100th time that day. At 23, she had been working at the base cafeteria for nearly 2 years, but today was different. Today marked the largest gathering of Marines the base had seen in months, with over 500 servicemen and women preparing for deployment overseas. Sarah had always taken pride in her work, treating every meal service as an opportunity to show respect for the brave men and women who risked their lives for their country. Her colleagues often joked that she worked with the dedication of a Marine herself, arriving early and staying late to ensure everything was perfect. What they didn't know was that Sarah carried a heavy burden in her heart, one that drove her to work harder than anyone else. 3 years earlier, Sarah's younger brother Michael had been killed in action while serving in Afghanistan. He was only 19 when he made the ultimate sacrifice. And Sarah had promised herself that she would honor his memory by serving those who continued to fight for freedom. Working at the Marine base wasn't just a job for her. It was a sacred duty. The cafeteria buzzed with activity as hundreds of Marines filed in for their meal. Sarah moved swiftly between tables, her tray balanced expertly as she served generous portions to each soldier. She made eye contact with each person she served, offering a warm smile and genuine words of gratitude. Many of the younger Marines reminded her of Michael, with their fresh faces and determined expressions. "Thank you for your service," she whispered to each table, meaning every word. Some Marines nodded politely, others smiled back, but all seemed touched by her sincerity. Word had already spread among the ranks about the dedicated civilian who treated them like family rather than just another customer to serve. As the lunch rush intensified, Sarah began to feel dizzy. She had been on her feet since 5 that morning, preparing for this massive service, and had barely eaten anything herself. The summer heat was particularly brutal that day, with temperatures soaring above 90 degrees, and the cafeteria's aging air conditioning system was struggling to keep up with the crowd. Sarah wiped the sweat from her forehead and continued working, determined not to let anyone down. She had promised the kitchen manager that she could handle the extra workload, and she wasn't about to break that promise. Each tray felt heavier than the last, but she pushed through the growing fatigue and dizziness. The noise in the cafeteria was overwhelming. Hundreds of conversations, mixed with the clatter of utensils and trays, creating a symphony of military life. Sarah tried to focus on the familiar sounds to steady herself, but her vision was starting to blur at the edges. She paused for a moment, gripping the edge of a nearby table to steady herself. A young Marine at the table looked up at her with concern. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, his voice cutting through the noise around them. Sarah forced another smile and nodded, assuring him that she was fine, just a little warm from the busy day. She picked up her tray and continued to the next table. But her hands were beginning to shake. The faces around her seemed to swirl together, and the voices became distant and muffled. Sarah knew something was wrong, but she couldn't abandon her post. These Marines were depending on her, and she had never let them down before. The last thing Sarah remembered clearly was approaching a table of senior officers. She had balanced their meals carefully on her tray, determined to serve them with the same respect and care she showed everyone else. As she reached for the first plate, her vision went completely dark, and she felt herself falling forward. The heavy tray crashed to the floor with a thunderous clatter that silenced the entire cafeteria. Sarah collapsed beside it, unconscious, before she hit the ground. The ceramic plates shattered around her, and food scattered across the floor. But none of that mattered now. The woman who had dedicated herself to serving others was now the one in desperate need of help. For a moment, the massive cafeteria fell into complete silence. 500 Marines, trained to react quickly in any situation, sat frozen as they processed what had just happened. The woman who had served them with such dedication and kindness was lying motionless on the floor, surrounded by the remnants of the meal she had been trying to deliver. Then, as if responding to an unspoken command, something extraordinary began to happen. The first Marine to stand was Sergeant Rodriguez, a grizzled veteran who had been served by Sarah countless times over the past 2 years. He rose slowly from his seat, his chair scraping against the floor in the sudden silence. One by one, other Marines began to follow suit. The young private who had asked if Sarah was okay stood next. Then the table of officers. Then entire sections of the cafeteria began rising in unison. What started as individual gestures of respect quickly became a coordinated tribute that no one had planned, but everyone understood. The silence in the cafeteria was profound as 500 Marines stood at attention around Sarah's unconscious form. Medical personnel had been called and were rushing to the scene, but in those precious moments, something beautiful was unfolding. The Marines weren't just standing. They were saluting. Sergeant Rodriguez had been the first to raise his hand to his forehead in a crisp military salute. His weathered face showed deep respect for the young woman who had served his meals with such care and dedication. He remembered every interaction with Sarah, how she always asked about his family back home, and remembered the names of his children. The salute spread like ripples across the cafeteria. Table by table, row by row, every single Marine in the room came to attention and rendered a perfect salute. These were seasoned warriors, young recruits, officers, and enlisted personnel, all united in their respect for someone who wasn't even in uniform, but had served them with the heart of a true patriot. Captain Williams, who commanded one of the units preparing for deployment, felt tears welling up in his eyes as he held his salute. He had eaten in this cafeteria hundreds of times over his 20-year career, but he had never seen anything like Sarah's dedication to their well-being. She knew the dietary restrictions of Marines with allergies, remembered who preferred their coffee black, and always had an encouraging word for those facing difficult deployments. The base medics arrived within minutes, but they too were struck by the scene before them. Paramedic Janet Collins, herself a former Marine, had to compose herself before she could begin treating Sarah. She had never witnessed such a spontaneous display of military respect for a civilian. The sight of 500 Marines holding a perfect salute while she worked on Sarah would stay with her for the rest of her life. As Janet checked Sarah's vital signs, she discovered that the young woman was severely dehydrated and exhausted. The combination of the extreme heat, long hours, and the physical demands of serving such a large crowd had pushed Sarah's body beyond its limits. Her pulse was weak but steady, and her breathing was shallow but regular. "She's going to be okay," Janet announced to the room, her voice carrying across the silent cafeteria. "But she needs immediate medical attention." The relief was palpable, though not a single Marine broke their salute or moved from position. While the medics worked to stabilize Sarah and prepare her for transport to the base hospital, stories began to circulate among the standing Marines about their interactions with this remarkable woman. Private Johnson whispered to his buddy about how Sarah had noticed he was homesick during his first week at the base and had slipped him an extra dessert with a note saying, "Your mom would be proud." Corporal Stevens remembered the day Sarah had worked through her lunch break to ensure that his unit received their meals before a last-minute training exercise. She had personally delivered food to their barracks, refusing any thanks and insisting it was the least she could do for their service. Lieutenant Garcia recalled how Sarah had stayed late one evening to prepare a special meal for Marines returning from a difficult mission overseas. She had coordinated with their families to recreate home-cooked favorites, understanding that sometimes the comfort of familiar food could help heal invisible wounds. These stories spread throughout the room in hushed tones, but the salute never wavered. Each Marine understood that they were witnessing something that transcended normal protocol. This wasn't about military regulations or proper procedure. This was about honoring someone who had honored them every single day. Sarah began to regain consciousness as the medics prepared her stretcher. Her eyes fluttered open, and she found herself looking up at a sea of faces in military dress. Confused and disoriented, she tried to sit up, but Janet gently pressed her back down. "Just rest, honey," Janet said softly. "You're going to be fine." Sarah's vision was still blurry, but as it began to clear, she realized something extraordinary was happening around her. Every person she could see was standing at attention, their hands raised in salute. "What's happening?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. She was struggling to understand why hundreds of Marines were saluting while she lay on the cafeteria floor surrounded by broken dishes and scattered food. Janet smiled down at her with tears in her eyes. "They're honoring you, sweetie. Every single one of them is showing you the respect you've shown them." Sarah's eyes widened as the magnitude of the moment began to sink in. As the medics lifted Sarah onto the stretcher, the formation of saluting Marines created a pathway to the door. Like an honor guard, they maintained their positions as she was wheeled through their ranks. The sight was so moving that several cafeteria workers who had gathered to watch were openly weeping. Sarah tried to speak, to thank them, to tell them this wasn't necessary, but her voice failed her. Instead, she raised a trembling hand to her heart and then extended it toward the Marines surrounding her. It was a gesture of gratitude, more profound than any words could express. Base Commander Colonel Harrison had arrived during the medical response and stood watching the unprecedented scene unfold. In his 30 years of military service, he had never witnessed such a spontaneous and unanimous display of respect. He knew that what was happening in this cafeteria would become part of base legend, a story that would be told for years to come. As Sarah's stretcher disappeared through the cafeteria doors, the 500 Marines remained at attention for several more minutes. The silence was finally broken when Colonel Harrison stepped forward and called out, "Order arms." The unified sound of hands dropping from salutes echoed through the room like a final tribute. The colonel cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion, as he addressed the assembled troops. "What you have just witnessed and participated in represents the very best of what it means to serve. This young woman has served each of you with honor, dedication, and selfless sacrifice. Today, you have shown her that service recognizes service, that honor acknowledges honor." The Marines slowly began to take their seats, but the atmosphere in the cafeteria had changed forever. Conversations buzzed with admiration for Sarah and pride in their collective response to her emergency. Many admitted they had never truly appreciated how much Sarah's daily kindness had meant to them until they saw her lying unconscious on the floor. At the base hospital, Sarah was quickly stabilized and given intravenous fluids to address her severe dehydration. Dr. Patricia Hayes, the attending physician, was amazed by the number of Marines who called or stopped by to check on Sarah's condition. She had treated many military personnel over the years, but she had never seen such concern for a civilian staff member. Word of what had happened in the cafeteria spread throughout the base within hours. Marines who hadn't been present wished they had been there to participate in the spontaneous tribute. Social media posts from family members who heard the story began to circulate. And soon, the incident was gaining attention far beyond Camp Pendleton. Sarah's recovery was swift, thanks to the excellent medical care and the overwhelming support from the Marine community. When she woke up fully the next morning, her hospital room was filled with flowers, cards, and small gifts from Marines throughout the base. Many included handwritten notes expressing gratitude for her service and sharing personal memories of how she had brightened their days. One card that particularly moved Sarah came from Private Martinez, no relation despite sharing her last name. He wrote about how Sarah had reminded him of his own sister, who had been killed in a car accident the year before. "Your smile every day helped me remember that there's still goodness in the world," he wrote. "Thank you for helping me heal." Colonel Harrison visited Sarah personally to check on her recovery and to share something important with her. He explained that her collapse had revealed something the command staff hadn't fully understood: how vital her role had become to the morale and well-being of the Marines on base. "Sarah," the colonel said, sitting beside her hospital bed, "what happened in that cafeteria yesterday wasn't just about respect. It was about recognition. Those Marines stood and saluted because they understand that you've been serving alongside them, even without wearing the uniform." The colonel went on to explain that the base was implementing new policies to ensure that civilian staff members like Sarah received better support and recognition for their contributions. Extended work hours during peak periods would be limited, additional staff would be hired during major events, and regular appreciation ceremonies would be established. "But most importantly," Colonel Harrison continued, "we want to offer you something special. The Marines have requested that you be given an honorary position as Base Morale Ambassador. It would recognize officially what everyone already knows, that your service to our service members is invaluable. Sarah was overwhelmed by the offer, but she was even more touched by what Colonel Harrison told her next. The Marines had collected donations to establish a scholarship fund in her brother Michael's name. The scholarship would support family members of fallen Marines who wanted to pursue careers in service to the military community. When Sarah returned to work a week later, she found that the cafeteria had been transformed. A plaque near the entrance read, "Dedicated to Sarah Martinez and all civilian personnel who serve our service members with honor." But the most meaningful change was in the attitudes of the Marines themselves. Every single person who entered the cafeteria now made a point of thanking Sarah personally. Many stopped to chat about their day, their families, or their upcoming deployments. The cafeteria had become more than just a place to eat. It had become a community center where genuine connections were formed daily. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had initiated the salute, became one of Sarah's closest friends on base. He told her that the spontaneous tribute had reminded all of them why they served, not just for their country, but for the people who made their country worth defending. The story of Sarah's collapse and the Marines' response spread far beyond Camp Pendleton. News outlets picked up the story, and it became a symbol of the mutual respect between military personnel and the civilians who support them. Sarah received letters from people across the country, thanking her for her service and sharing their own stories of military family members. 6 months later, when the unit that had been present during Sarah's collapse returned from their deployment, they organized a special ceremony in the same cafeteria. Every Marine who had been there that day was recognized, not for their military achievements, but for their demonstration of honor and respect. Sarah spoke at the ceremony, finally able to express what she had been unable to say that day in the hospital. "You stood for me when I couldn't stand for myself," she said, her voice strong and clear. "But the truth is, I stand for you every single day. We serve each other, and that's what makes our military family strong." The ceremony concluded with Sarah leading the assembled Marines in a moment of silence for all fallen service members, including her brother Michael. As they stood together in the same cafeteria where she had collapsed, Sarah realized that sometimes the greatest honor isn't in the uniform you wear, but in the service you provide and the respect you earn. The 500 Marines who had stood to salute Sarah that day had taught her something profound. True military bearing isn't just about following orders or wearing a uniform. It's about recognizing honor wherever you find it and responding with dignity, respect, and unity. In their spontaneous tribute, they had shown that the highest form of military courtesy is acknowledging the service of others, regardless of their rank or role. Sarah continued to work at Camp Pendleton for many years after that day, eventually becoming the base morale ambassador and helping to establish programs that better supported both military personnel and civilian staff. The story of her collapse and the Marine salute became part of base tradition, told to every new arrival as an example of the values that define their community. Years later, when people asked Sarah about that day, she would smile and say, "I went unconscious while serving, but I woke up, surrounded by the greatest honor guard in the world. 500 Marines taught me that service isn't about the uniform you wear. It's about the heart you bring to everything you do."